Last week, this happened.
Neil Rajendra, an Indian origin chief diversity, equity and inclusion officer at NASA, has been fired despite the space agency reportedly changing her designation to avoid US President Donald Trump's crackdown on DEI initiatives.
This is not an isolated incident. In fact, several of the biggest names have either cut back on their DEI spends or rolled back initiatives.
So in case you missed it, companies like Meta, Amazon, Walmart, and even McDonald's in the US have recently announced major cutbacks in their diversity, equity, and inclusion or DEI initiatives.
But not everyone has decided to tread this path.
Apple shareholders have rejected a proposal that would have scrapped the company's diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. A conservative think tank drafted the plan to remove the company's diversity resources. It wanted Apple to join a wave of major companies who are ending their programs. But Apple shareholders voted overwhelmingly in favor of keeping the initiatives in place, with 97% of ballots cast against the plan to remove DEI.
At the crux of it all is an acronym, DEI, which stands for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. Something that on the face of it doesn't seem controversial at all. Who'd want to oppose this, right? Wrong.
We believe that whether you are a doctor, an accountant, a lawyer, or an air traffic controller, you should be hired and promoted based on skill and competence, not race or gender. The poison of critical race theory from our public schools, and I signed an order making it the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
That was US President Donald Trump addressing a joint session of Congress a month ago where he reiterated his stance on scrapping DEI policies. But what does any of this have to do with India? Has DEI really taken off in the Indian context? Is it restricted more to multinational companies rather than Indian firms? Is DEI a concept that is only being adopted by tech firms? Are more traditional businesses warming up to it? How does the Trump administration's take on DEI impact companies in India? Are companies rolling back on projects now? Does that spell trouble for firms that help companies with their DEI initiatives? Does DEI really help to better a company's bottom line? We explore all of this and more in today's episode, where we speak to an ace DEI practitioner and consultant, as well as a hiring whiz on all things diversity and inclusion in Indian workplaces. It's Tuesday, April 22nd. I'm your host, Dia Rekhi, and you are listening to The Morning Brief from The Economic Times. Let's start with some context setting. Donald Trump's second term has been nothing short of tumultuous and full of twists and turns. It all started with him signing executive orders like they were going out of fashion. One such order was passed on January 20th, which said that the Biden administration had forced illegal and immoral discrimination programs going by the name of DEI into virtually all aspects of the federal government in areas ranging from airline safety to the military. The White House in its communication said, and I quote, "Nearly every federal agency and entity submitted equity action plans to detail the ways that they have furthered DEI's infiltration of the federal government. The public release of these plans demonstrated immense public waste and shameful discrimination. That ends today." End quote. This was a huge policy shift, and in many ways a reversal of another executive order that brought in DEI as a concept. Here's Ishani Roy, founder and CEO of DEI consultancy Serein, talking about how DEI not only came into being, but also taking us through what all of this means for companies in India. Thank you once again for joining us on the Morning Brief. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Before we dive into what is happening today, I just wanted to know if you could give us a brief history of, how DEI really came into being, just something for our listeners to sort of have as a context.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast, Dia. Lovely to be on. I think I love your question, how DEI came into being. So if you look back, you can think about any country which has any of these labor mandates, right? Equal opportunities mandates. It started in the 1960s. In America, for example, it was an executive order that was passed by the president to basically say that you have to hire without regard to any religion or race or any origin. And this all came after the civil rights movement. Similar things kind of happened in India as well. We do have the equal opportunities policy, which says that any employer with more than 20 employees have to have an equal opportunities policy. So that's the basic thing of equity. Now, once again, if you think about what are the other basic things about equality, equity, or inclusion, first thing that comes to mind is safety. So, for example, if you think about how safe India is in the workplace, you will always go back to Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act. So when the Nirbhaya case happened in Delhi, there was a huge upheaval about archaic sort of criminal laws. And there was change that happened to the criminal act, which is the IPC, right? And then we also got in 2013 the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act. So in its basic form, you can think about it is only a few decades old when it comes to making the workplace safer and equitable.
Right. And, something that you mentioned, which was interesting, was that it was passed through an executive order. And from then to now, we have another executive order that basically scraps it. Right? So I wanted to understand from you, Ishani, how did you take the news when it first came out? I mean, it's been some time, so I'm guessing you had some time to sit and think over it. But when it first came out, what was your reaction?
Yes, I mean, that's a great question. And my first question was disbelief. I mean, this cannot happen. Even if a person or a few handful of people who are so privileged that they do not understand the need for equity or need to have a workplace or society which makes it safe and inclusive for everyone is just a few people. But then again, I think one of the things it's very important to think about is go deeper and understand how did this get implemented so fast. So one of the most revealing sort of discussion around this is to understand, why did companies go back on the DEI programs? Obviously, a few of them did not. There are many who have stood up and said that, no, we believe in equity, we believe in inclusion, but many have rolled back their resources and programs. So why did they actually do that? Was there merit in having an open conversation? That is something I think we are still kind of thinking through. So yes, we are kind of still coming to terms with it, but also there has been a reckoning in the DEI world about what is the right way of doing things.
So if I were to ask you, what is the right way for doing things? What would you tell our listeners? I mean, if there is someone who owns a company out there and is thinking about possibly rolling back their DEI initiatives or not having one at all, what would you tell them?
I think this is a great question. Absolutely great question. I think what we first and foremost kind of have to understand is to forget the jargon. So forget everything about DEI. The best thing to do is understand that you have to have a team that clearly understands the different markets' needs. To be able to do that, you have to have people who represent those different markets. Now, that just translates to having a diverse set of people. And you know how to keep them and make them most productive by having an inclusive workplace. You will have a better product, you'll have a better service. End of the day, you will have better business outcome. So if you just look at any of your apps today that you use in India, any of the food ordering apps, anything else that you see, you will see a lot of local components. So if you move around the country, you will see it changing, it's customizing itself to the language and the the need of that market there. And that's being done by a diverse set of people who are constantly studying the market, right? So the fact that we are penetrating into tier 2, tier 3 cities, that's DEI for you. So people who have been able to do that for the longest time, they're just going to keep on doing it. People who did that for, more of what we call rainbow washing, or what we call just for branding's sake, those are the ones who are probably going to take a step back and realize that those kind of efforts are not sustainable or really do not prove to be useful in the end.
Sure. But Ishani, I mean, everything finally boils down to the numbers, right? Especially
Yes.
for companies. What have you seen and what can you share with us to sort of talk about how DEI isn't just a concept, and it's not something that, is just meant to be sort of, in your books as some additional thing that you do, but rather really provides and adds value to a company's bottom line?
Absolutely. I think that is the biggest question. And that's where we are seeing that people who have been doing it in the right way, for example, always having policies to make sure people are safe. If there are different diverse people represented in the leadership so that they find themselves growing in an organization, these are the basic sort of pillars of the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we are seeing is people who have always been doing it the right way, they are continuing to do it. And when you ask like whether DNI is end of the day helpful, the bottom line, yes, absolutely. I mean, in a country like ours, for us, inclusion is something that is kind of built in the DNA of everything that you start, whether it's a small company of 20 employees or whether it's an MNC, we know how to work, how to have policies so all of these different people can actually work cohesively. I don't think we are going to see anything dipping at the moment. Our female labor force participation have been going up in the last few years, which we will continue to see going up. Our reported cases of sexual harassment has been going up, which means more and more companies are becoming compliant, for example. So there are a lot of positives that are happening. But yes, there is a chance that bigger companies are going to cut their budgets on certain programs.
And you're seeing that happen already. What are these places that they're cutting down budgets for? Like, would it be posh training, for instance, or is it something else?
We work in different geographies. So our biggest market is Asia, then Europe. And yes, America was one of our biggest markets as well. And that is where we are seeing the cuts. Definitely, there are a lot of rollbacks in the programs. So bigger budget programs in US are definitely getting cut. But what we are not seeing is that affecting Asia. So the rate of incoming clients, for example, for POSH compliances, sexual harassment trainings, even basic compliances and policies, for example, there has been no change. We see the same number because end of the day, it's compliance and we are a growing economy, right? We are not reliant on US funding. So those places, we are really not seeing any change. Europe hasn't even shown that kind of change in their social mindset. I actually believe that in Europe, there's going to be a pushback to all of this rollback. And within another 6 months or so, we will see more work that's going to be done in Asia and Europe.
Right. Coming to India specifically, Ishani, I mean, there are two versions of this that I have been hearing from people, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. One is that you have MNCs that are, say, for instance, US headquartered MNCs, which are following the trend of their parent company in the US itself. But I'd like you to talk about not just the MNCs, but also about Indian companies and whether we are seeing Indian companies also warming up to DEI as a concept, and which are the sectors that are really at the forefront of it.
That's a great question. Always tech. So out of 500 of our clients, I would say tech would be the majority. Over 70% would be tech companies, which are very, very not just warming up, but the last 5 years, they have done a lot of work in terms of D&I. Then I would say that it actually depends on who you're providing services to. Companies who are going to sort of feel it and cut down on the programs will be the ones who are dependent on the US market. And the rest of them who are not, say, for example, all of our B2C companies, are not going to see it so soon. So there is not going to be any rollback of programs. And the other way to also think about it is startups versus MNCs. We see that a lot of MNCs have their basics done, right? Which means policies. Now, where do startups have an advantage? There are two ways. One is that they have to be compliant because a lot of them have to raise money for due diligence. They have to always be compliant. Then the second place where they also do well, in my experience of few hundred companies I have worked with, is that they also have a hiring shortage in India, which means lack of talent, right? That means you want less attrition and a higher retention. So a lot of the startups are seeing that you need to have very good internal communication. You need to have actually a good inclusive environment where people really feel like they want to stay longer. So a lot of times what we see in startups is that they use these kind of conversations like LGBTQ inclusion, talking about respect at work, talking about inclusive leadership. We get to work on a lot of groundbreaking ideas with the startups because they use it to our advantage to keep people on.
We're switching gears a bit here and bringing in Munira Loliwala from TeamLease Digital to talk more about what's happening on the ground with companies across the board in India. We get her to weigh in with numbers to talk about just how pervasive DEI initiatives have gotten in India, while also giving us her views on why she believes what is going on in the US will not have much of an impact on India's progress when it comes to DEI. Thank you so much, Munira, for joining us on the Morning Brief. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hello, Dia. Hello, everyone, to all the listeners.
As someone who's really working with companies on the ground for hiring specifically, just to get a sense of where things stand right now, Munira, how seriously does India Inc. take DEI today?
To be very honest with you, Dia, I think we've shifted from the social and moral responsibilities towards DEI to becoming or making it more as a key essential driver for organizational growth and success. I think 3 out of 4 organizations today adopt DEI policies, and HR delegates today practice DEI efforts, and they have a clear-cut budget and plan framed out over the next 2 years for DEI. Overall, I think between 2023-24, we've seen DEI policies increase year on year with a greater than 15 to 18% in most organizations. This year, as compared to last year, the shift will be from a 68% in 2024 to an upwards of 75% in DEI policies across. Organizations are also experiencing a constant 15% to 20% boost in employee engagement by practicing more DEI and an inclusive workforce. But we also see is that there's a remarkable improvisation and change in overall profitability. So anywhere where larger organizations are using innovative practices within DEI, that's demonstrating into a straight 8% rise in productivity. In fact, it was quite surprising to understand that most of the Indian MNCs, have made a remarkable impact by practicing DEI. So that's a little bit about how we as in India are adopting this.
I also wanted you to give our listeners a sense of, which are the sectors that are ahead, right? Last time when we spoke, again, you spoke extensively about how tech, BFSI, these are really leading the charge. But are we seeing others in the manufacturing spaces, for instance, catching up?
Interestingly, yes, there's been a quite amount of shift within the traditional organizations for whom, practicing DEI has not been large, right? I think it also was because of their areas of operation and the regions that they operate out of. When we speak about manufacturing, automotives, retail, FMCG, logistics, media. And within these organizations, when you also speak about companies that are more Indian in nature, MNCs, Indian MNCs, or we speak about the mid-level of organizations, I think these for now are practicing 3 things very effectively. And those are, 1, enhancing the gender diversity, which is also a bigger task for them considering that they operate out of the quite rural tier 2, tier 3 cities and towns within India. Second most important is overall the leadership contribution of gender diversity, expanding the inclusion of PWDs. In fact, if you see in India, most of the PWDs are largely within concise towards more of the tech organization and the rest scattered within the traditional companies. And third most important is enriching the ethnic and regional diversity. Because of the nature of their business, it was important that they focus on that rather than just looking at how their corporate HOs would diversify and sitting. So they've actually focused more on pure execution at DEI, and they've seen year-on-year changes.
When we speak of DEI, like you said, it boils down to the value it adds to a company, right? So could you give us a sense, number-wise, of how it has added value to Indian companies? Are there any statistics available that you can sort of share with us about how DEI helps companies?
Most organizations are now one step ahead of completely driving DEI through AI and data analytics, which means they are making investments to use data, AI to kind of visualize the performance, look at the trends and analysis of what DEI has been bringing to actual workforce or implications of DEI that has been in productivity, employee engagement, retention, taking care of the unfair practices, biasness in hiring or appraisal cycles, performance reviews, and so on and so forth. However, for most organizations still today, measuring DEI and kind of its impact at the profitability level overall from an organization perspective is still a question mark. But yes, I think the organizations have definitely been able to do one analysis which is about their hiring. Yeah, and they've seen a lot of change towards the hiring when they have been practicing DEI effectively. But if you look at some numbers, say for example, there's been about a 0.5% rise in the representation of persons with special abilities, between 2024 and this year. That's what we're expecting. We haven't seen this rise in the last few years at all, So that's one of the change that we're seeing. We've also seen quite an amount of representation of non-binary and transgender employees from a near 1% to a 1.5% this year. Also neurodiversity, which has been 7 to 10%, of the overall number. But if you look at neurodiversity in IT, that has been lower than 5% also, which means the rest of the industries are really catching up on that. So I think those are some of the numbers that today India is looking at.
Munira, how does the Trump administration's executive order sort of scrapping DEI affect all of this progress? Or do you feel like it's completely separate and unrelated in a sense to the progress we are making in India and that will continue to go on?
I think Indian organizations are at a different stage in this journey of DEI. We're looking to see if the pipeline is equitable and do the right thing based on our challenges and objectives. Also, I think if you look at overall, there had been a decline, so some statistics spoke about the decline in diverse hiring percentage, or rather the overall DEI between May last year to May this year. So the overall hiring dropped from a 33% in May last year to about a 29% in Feb in 2025 this year. And it's further expected to slightly drop to about a 28 or a 27% as we go in the first quarter of this financial year. However, today our statistics are 1 in every 5 organization is in the developing stage. 1 in every 4 organization is still either unenforced or completely absent in LGBTQAI++ support. We have our challenges of limited or no training. We have our lack of readiness to adapt. We have a lack of infrastructure, and we have a lack of consistency at our end to kind of, practice these DEIs. But the global push from MNCs add to the overall momentum. I don't think that the impact will be too large to kind of put a pause or to kind of change. But the DEI accountability framework of organizations in India is also a function of, government mandates. So our Maternity Benefit Acts, our POSH Acts, our RPWD Act, and our SEBI directives of Women on Board all put together kind of constantly push the initiatives in India. So we are likely to expect some turbulence, but having said that, this is more of a strategic correction, or rather more of a strategy that is being rebuilt for the next 5 years for India.
Absolutely. So Munira, if you had to crystal gaze and give us a sense of how you see things going forward for DEI in India, what would you say?
I think what requires for us to do at this stage is that we need to adopt to more multi-strategies ranging from tweaking our hiring to our career development programs, making more accountability at every level, especially at the mid and the entry levels. For example, a simple thing, how many of our interviewing panels are diverse today? So organizations need to, I think, bring those smaller changes before we kind of, build the larger forums and groups. I think we need to strengthen our environmental, social, and governance roadmap to kind of make it more impactful. And we'll have to also see how our regional environment is made more inclusive when it comes to DEI, because that's a larger market for India today. While we continue to focus on our metros or on our tier 1 cities, gender diversity, specifically to say women inclusive, is still a very important criteria. While organizations, some may have reached to a 30% gender diversity, but there are some who are still at anywhere between a 12 to 15% and want to move up to the 40% mark. There are some organizations who are at a 50% gender diversity, and they have seen a remarkable impact in their profitability and productivity, or even in employee engagement, because those initiatives kind of bring more attraction to talent of the same nature. So I think these are some of the changes that we are seeing constantly. And, I think we will move to that area where organizations will move to a percentage of hiring for these communities. And that's how I think the whole inclusiveness will be built towards.
I agree with Ishani when she said that in India, you don't necessarily need to manufacture diversity because we're inherently a very diverse populace. If you just look at the team putting out this podcast, we collectively speak more than 6 languages at the very minimum. At the same time, I recognize that there are barriers to entry and workplaces need to be more diverse in terms of gender, caste, religion, and more. The US scrapping DEI is one thing, but companies like Apple also refusing to back down is also an indicator that there are companies that see real value in having people from diverse backgrounds working together. So call it what you want, DEI or otherwise, the concept is likely to live on in some shape or form. Thank you, Ishani and Munira. It's Tuesday, April 22nd. I'm your host, Dia Rekhi, and you were listening to The Morning Brief from the Economic Times. This episode was produced by Vinay Joshi and Anirban Chaudhary, sound design by Indraneel Bhattacharjee. Do share and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Thank you and have a great day. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.